no editor should ever make an author cry. There should never be a time when the comments are so harsh that an author feels used or abused or anything like that. Um, Editors are supposed to be your allies, not your enemies.
Welcome to Stories and Stanza, a weekly podcast bringing you real stories from creators and speakers around the world. Hi Sue, welcome to Stories and Stanza. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. How are you? And thanks for having me.
I'm good, thanks. Just starting my Saturday. It's been a We are in winter now, and it's sometimes raining, and sometimes we are
Mm,
lucky to see a sunny day. But today, from the looks of it, it's a bit gloomy. Uh, it is, but we had a good weather throughout the week, so that's okay.
okay. And we just finished a lot of rain from a hurricane here, and we're in the middle of summer where I am.
Yeah. Yeah. I find this very interesting that whenever I talk to a guest, most of the times the guest is in a different season than
Hmm.
Australia. So, and when I first
Right.
came to Australia, it took me a while to get accustomed to the different weather pattern. Like when you are expecting summer, you're getting a winter. It looked like the body clock
Right.
takes a couple of years to get
I bet
adjusted.
it does. Yeah.
Yeah. So in Stories and Stanza, I talk to writers, creators, and a few other people just who have a story to share. And as a writer, my focus is in that area, in the broad spectrum of writing, from fiction to non-fiction to poetry, and all the different areas. So I'm looking forward to our chat today. And before we start, could you mind telling a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Sue Toth, and I am not a writer, surprisingly. I actually work on the other side of books. I work on the editing side. I'm a book coach and an editor, and I help writers if they're stuck at any point in the writing process, and I help them to, get unstuck or get their thoughts out of their head. And then when their work is finished, I help them edit it.
Thank you so much for creating that support space for writers. As someone who writes a very little bit, though I have a day job, and I managed to write a little bit of poetry given my available time, but I understand the importance of a book, a writing coach, and an editor in a writer's life. So let us hear from you about your journey, and how you work with writers, and how what help could assist writers in achieving their goals, because I know a lot of people who want to write, but because they don't have that support layer, they're not able to transition from an idea that's in their mind to something that's in the published world.
And that's one of the first things I help with, is that if a person has an idea in their head, but they don't know where to begin, that's where I can come in and help them. I don't do ghostwriting per se, but I will help a person who will come to me and say, I have this idea, I have this outline, I have this thing that I really need to get out, and I just don't know where to begin. So through a process of interviewing and just a conversation and just, talking to them about their idea and their story, usually what will end up happening is they'll say, "Oh my gosh, I never would have thought of doing it that way." And then that gets them started in the process. Another thing I do is if someone is stuck, maybe they're writing a piece of fiction and all of a sudden they don't know which way to go with the story, or there's a character who they simply don't know what to do with. They wrote the person into the book and now they don't have much of a point of being there anymore. I can go through things like, okay, what should we do with this character? Can we make him or her more important to the story, or would it be better to just eliminate them completely? If someone is stuck in the middle of the story, and again, I usually do this through a series of just conversations and interviews, I'll just say, all right, let's talk about it. When you first started, where did you think this person or this scene was going to go? And, through some guided conversation, I usually get them to a place where they figure out, okay, so this is how it should be. This is what I wanted the whole time. So usually it's just sort of talking it through with a person who's not as close to the story. And it just gives an author another perspective.
Yes, another set of ears bouncing the ideas. That is really fantastic. A podcast came up in my recommendation this week, and I was listening to the host explaining the book writing process, as in finding a story that a writer wants to say, and then having that control over language and articulation. So sometimes wannabe writers, they focus on one over the other, and that is when they do not get over the line to the published world. So yeah, I'm
That
looking
is
forward
true.
to hear your stories. So first, tell me, how did you get started on this path?
Well, it goes back actually to my childhood. I always loved to read. I've loved to read since I was a little girl. Long before there were Kindles or ebooks or anything like that, I was the kid who would have the flashlight on under the bed, hours after she was supposed to be sleeping, reading my book. And my mother would come in and take the flashlight away from me and make me go to sleep. Um, I've stayed up till 4 o'clock in the morning when I have to be up at 6 because I'm reading such a good book I can't stop. I'm sure a lot of your listeners who are readers will relate to that. So when it came time to pick a major in college, I naturally went in the direction of English. And I got my English degree along with my teaching degree. So for many years, I taught writing. I taught it at the high school level and then at the college level. And I also had a career in journalism. I was a reporter. I'm naturally a very nosy person. I love to ask questions. Drives a lot of people crazy, but I do love to ask questions. So I got into journalism for a very long time and I loved writing, but I really loved more helping the new writers to hone their skills. And I kind of always knew that's where I was going to end up. So one time when I was working for a media outlet, a small one, I had to interview an author who had just finished a fiction book and she lived in the town that I was covering. So she asked me if I would be interested in reading her book. And of course, I said yes. And when I read it, there were a lot of issues. It was a really good story. It had a lot of potential, but there were a lot of things that I saw that needed to be changed. So I told her that, very honestly. And she said, "Oh my gosh, I wish I would have written you a long time ago. You could have helped me so much more." And so that was it. Then the editing bug bit me, and I've taken lots of courses and gotten certifications and continued my teaching career. But eventually, I went out on my own and opened my own business where I work solely with authors who are anywhere in the writing process.
That's amazing. That's amazing to hear, and very inspiring as well. And often I see that writers, they do not I mean, they write the book, but it's hard to see that from a reader's point of view, and I think which is where your views come in and assist the writer. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. So from your experience, what are some of the common areas where the writers find that challenge?
Well, something you just said a moment ago really speaks to me. Um, Writers don't always see things from their reader's perspective. They have a story in mind, they have it in their head, and they know what they want to say. So they just say it in that particular fashion. And sometimes there'll be large pieces of time that are just completely skipped over, or a character will be introduced and then will just disappear suddenly. off the book. So those are a lot of the things that I see a lot of. I really try the biggest thing I try and help authors with is to make sure the continuity is there, make sure the flow is there, make sure that their story starts out making sense and continues to make sense throughout the whole thing. And sometimes as an author is writing, that's where they get tripped up. They just can't see the forest through the trees. And sometimes there's a lot of stuff that needs to be cut, or sometimes there's a big giant area where they've completely skipped something. And I'll say, well, what happened in this 6-month period? Those are the big picture things that I see.
Right. So this is a very long process, right? At the ideation stage, and then
Yes.
the writing, and then polishing,
Yeah.
editing. So, for the benefit of new writers, can you explain the timeline sort of thing, like where which component fits in and where do you work?
Okay. Well, as a book coach, I will work with an author at almost any stage. As I mentioned earlier, I don't do ghostwriting, so I really don't start from the very beginning. But an author can be 3 chapters into a book and say, I have these 2 ideas and I just don't know which way to go. So I can help them at that point. Or, they can be toward the end and it's like, I just don't know how to end this thing. I really need help figuring out a satisfying ending. So that's where I help as a book coach. As an editor, my work begins after the author's is complete, because once there's a book, a full story in place, it's usually a better idea to have somebody else read it and you back off of it for a week or two while the editor reads it. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It can be, if let's say you're working on a Google Doc and the author and the editor are in there at the same time, changes are being made and you kind of don't know what's going on. And, you're both might be changing things over one another. So that never really works. So the editing process can and really should start when the book is complete. Book coaching can come at any time. I've coached authors at many different stages of their writing.
So, can you share some success stories in the book coaching space? Of course, I mean, not sharing the name of the writer, but more from your experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had an author that I worked with once who was a retired airline pilot, and he was writing a thriller novel about a plane being hijacked. And of course, it makes a lot of sense that a retired pilot would write a story like that, because hopefully he didn't have any real close up experience with it. But, pilots know about these sorts of things. So he's writing, and I'm going over chapters as he's writing them. And he's giving us every piece of background about what happens before a flight takes off, every machine that has to be checked, the amount of air pressure that has to be in things, the amount of fuel that has to be in the plane, the amount of pounds a plane can take on. I mean, the information was just going on and on and on and on. I think you can probably see where I'm going with this. We got to chapter 11 and the plane hadn't even taken off yet. And this was a thriller. And obviously, in a thriller, the reader wants to be thrilled and, wants to see some action fairly quickly. So, as we're going on with the chapters, I said, we really need to cut these back. We really need to get rid of some of this technical jargon. And then every time he'd give me another chapter, it was more technical jargon, and we went back and forth on it. And I finally said to him, and I think this is what really made him stop and think. I said, "Who is your audience for this book?" And he said, "Well, of course I want people who work for airlines to read it." I said, okay, that's fine, but is that all? Or do you want other people besides people who know airplanes to read it? He said, well, no, of course I want other people to read it. And I said, then you've got to cut some of this stuff out because people are going to get bored. People who don't know what you're talking about. And you have to figure that's a vast majority of your audience isn't going to sit through 10 chapters of the PSI pressure and I don't even remember all the stuff that was in
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah.
So that was a success story because I finally got him to cut a lot of that stuff out. And we finally got it to where the plane took off in chapter 3 and crashed in chapter 4. Much, much better, you know, much better of a way to do it to keep people on the edge of their seats. So that was a success story from a book coaching standpoint. I had I have a client that I'm actually working with right now who has 3 different, it turns out that it's a series. It's going to end up being 3 different books. But she had her main character wanting to do 3 very major separate things all in one book. And I said, that's going to get crazy long. People may not read all of that. Have you considered a trilogy? And she said, I never thought about that. So now she's turning it into a 3-book series.
Wow.
So these are the sorts of I would say, success stories that I have.
Absolutely. And it's good for the writer. And I think it's very interesting from your working experience as well that you get that taste of variety from working with different writers. Uh, my next question around that is, do you always work with fiction writers or non-fiction memoir, that sort of area as well?
I do work with nonfiction writers. I will say that I shy away from anything that's super, super technical. Um, there are areas that I won't delve into because I know I'm not good at them. And I'm going to be honest with myself as an editor and with you as a potential client. If I'm not going to do the best job possible editing your book, then I'm not the right person for you. So I will work with nonfiction. One thing that I've done a lot that I really enjoy is if people have blogs and they want to turn blogs into a book, I will help them separate them and put them into chapters and, figure out what topics go together and if there's a lot of information on one topic and not enough on another topic. So I've done that. I have worked with people writing memoirs. That I don't do them as often, but I have done it. My sweet spot is definitely fiction, but nonfiction, self-help, and business type books. I love to work on those as well.
That's nice. I mentioned nonfiction because one of the last couple of episodes that I published was with a writing coach who guides specifically on nonfiction, and I got to know
Okay.
some interesting pointers. And if I known them previously, I would have pointed other guests towards her, because in nonfiction there is that trick of how much of it is real and how much of it can be fictionalized for the sake of the story, that finding that balance. And I when that came up, like how our memories would narrate an event and how that translates into a book, I found that very interesting. That's why I
Yes.
asked you that, do you work only with fiction writers or nonfiction
And
as
it's
well?
funny with memoirs that, that's a big part of it is the fact that our memories from 20 or 30 or 40 years ago could be very different as adults than they were when we were children, or our perspective may have changed because we've grown up and matured and things like that. So that's what makes memoirs, excuse me, a little bit more difficult to work with because you do have that, did this really happen this way? Um, you hear all the time, there's a very famous memoir out right now, and that's the one by Prince Harry called Spare. And all of a sudden now everybody's saying, oh no, that never happened that way. He's lying. But this is his memories and how he
Yes,
remembers things happening. So I think it's unfair to say that, oh, he's lying, because that's not necessarily the case. He remembers things in his way.
that's very true. That's very true. So let us shift towards the editing side of things. So can you talk us through the different stages of editing and what is your preference? Where do you mostly work?
Okay. Um, there are three main stages of editing as I see it. There's developmental editing is the first one, and that is when you look over the whole story. You look at the plot, you look at the story arcs, you look at the characters, you look at the setting. Do they all make sense? Do they all flow? Does it make for a good and interesting and intriguing story? The next section would be, and people call it different things, line editing or copy editing. And for me, I think those are two different types of editing. Line editing is when you look at sentences and you really make sure the sentences flow, the language fits the time period. Um, I'll give you an example of that. I recently edited a book that took place in the 1920s, and two male friends were greeting each other, and one said, "Yo, bro." And I said, "I don't really think that they said that in the 1920s." Um, so, I look at that sort of thing. And then that's also the point where people will look at the punctuation, the grammar, the spelling. Um, do all the speakers have quotes around what they've said? Are the quotes placed correctly? That kind of thing. The final stage of editing is proofreading. And that generally comes when you've had your book typeset. It's already looks like it's going to look in a book format. And you have somebody do that one last check to, make sure that there wasn't something that everybody else missed, or that during the typesetting process, something crazy didn't happen with the printing. Um, so these are the things that you look for in proofreading.
Yes. And from your experience, if you were to suggest the writers that they can
Mhm.
improve the quality of their work, what would you recommend that they do? Of course, they cannot see the editor's perspective, but what are the things
Right.
they can do differently?
Um, well, there's a lot of things that I think can be done. First of all, I think that you, as the author, need to make sure that your book is really at a place where it's finished. Don't send it out to an editor and say, well, I still have to write the last three chapters. That's not a great idea. Um, Read it over and catch whatever errors you can. No editor is going to expect an author to be perfect at grammar and all that stuff, because that's why we're here. But if it's too messy, it's very distracting for the editor to try and clean up all the mistakes while they're trying to read the story. Um, the other thing I would say is editors are not the enemy. And I know that sounds like kind of a bold statement, but there are a lot of authors who feel like an editor is going to take their work and pick it apart. And they're going to change my voice and it's not going to be my story anymore. And I don't want to use an editor for this because of all that. I personally want your success. I'm probably beyond you. I'm probably the person that wants to see your success the most. Everything I tell you is going to be a suggestion based on my experience as an editor and as a reader. Don't just discount it and say, oh, that's stupid. They don't know what I was trying to say, so I'm not going to use this. A good editor wants you to succeed and wants to see your book do well. And they are making their suggestions based on that, not just because they can. Um, I think it's important for an author to, when they look at an editor's suggestions, sit on it for a little while, process it, leave it for a day or a week or however much time you can afford to leave it for, and then go back and look at it. On the other hand, I will say no editor should ever make an author cry. There should never be a time when the comments are so harsh that an author feels used or abused or anything like that. Editors are supposed to be your allies, not your enemies.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I am looking back at I am a published poet. I mean, I haven't written
Mhm,
fiction as a book till now, maybe here and there, but not as a book. But I remember working with my editor in the when I was publishing my first book, because I was not sure whether I should go ahead with this book or not, and which is where
mhm.
I sent it and I said that please tell me if this should go into publishing or not, and then you can tell me suggestions. And then I worked with a poetry editor, which is very hard to find, and
I'm sure.
yeah, and luckily I worked with someone who is in the same geography, is a little bit more handover, easy to work with, and then I got that direction. Okay, so these are the areas that I need to look at, and this is the how the end product can be. So I can absolutely understand the importance of an editor and what you're saying, that editor wants to see the book succeed. That's, I think, a very crucial message.
Hmm.
So we talked about book coaching, and we talked about the editing, and this is so I had a question like that, like if someone you think is in a writer's block, they're in the middle of their writing, so do
Hmm.
you, as a book coach, do you step in there, or you
I
don't,
do.
because you do? Okay.
I do. Yeah. And writer's block can come for a number of different reasons. And I'm not a psychologist by any stretch, but I have seen some fairly common reasons for it. Um, it could be because you're just not happy with what you're writing. And as a book coach, I can get to the bottom of that, and I'll ask questions like, well, you know, what do you think it is that you're stuck on? Why is this a problem for you? How do you feel about this character or this scene or whatever it might be? And generally we can get something out of them that kind of pushes them forward. It can also come from something as simple as looking at the same four walls all the time. So I suggest, go write at a coffee shop, go out. If it's a nice day, go sit in the park with your computer and write, change your scenery. Um, Sometimes people just say, oh, I just don't have enough time. And so then I might recommend time management tools, which I myself do not do, but I can recommend websites they can look at and things like that, that will help them kind of get past that, or help them to be able to build some time into their day for writing.
That's very interesting, and I think that would assist someone who is going through the writing process, because it can be exhausting. It can be
It
very,
can.
yeah,
It's very solitary too. That's the
yes.
problem. There's no interaction. You're sitting in a desk by yourself with nobody to keep you company, and that can be difficult.
Absolutely. So, yeah, we talked about your experience and the areas that you work with. Can you tell our listeners how they can engage you or approach you if they want to hire your services?
Yes. My website is www.suetoth, SUETOTH.com. Um, and on there, you will find my email address, my phone number, all of my social media pages. I have a Facebook page, an Instagram, and a LinkedIn, all of which you can find if
I
you
will
go to
put
that
that in the
site.
episode description, of course. Yes. So yeah,
Okay.
what I was asking
Uh,
is, can listeners
mhm.
approach you directly? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yes, because I am a solopreneur business, so it's not like you have to go through somebody else to find me. You just go to my website and you'll get me.
Fantastic. And I think we are in the end of our discussion. So, uh, can you highlight anything that we haven't covered, or any testimonial that you would like to share with the audience?
Um, just don't give up. If you have a dream and you want to write something, do not give up on it, because the right person can help you get that information out of your head and onto a piece of paper. And you never know what's going to happen after that. So don't ever give up.
Thank you so much. I think the writers need to hear that more often.
I
And
think so too.
yeah, and a helping hand. What you said, that the editor doesn't want the book to fail; they want the book to succeed. And
And
oh, yeah,
I guess the one quick thing I would add is that if you're finding an editor that is doing that, that is being harsh and is telling you that, oh my God, this book is terrible and it's not going to make it, then they're not the right editor for you. You need an ally in this process. And there are editors who will be your allies. They're out there.
absolutely, absolutely. That was very inspiring. So, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to Stories and Stanza today. I
Thank you
enjoyed
for
talking to
having me.
you.
It was wonderful.